Aloha, I'm Dr. John Davidann, and I'm the instructor for History 1002 OL Global Crossroads. So today we're going to talk about the material for week 6, and the main theme of this is the strength of Western imperialism in the 19th century, and then the varied responses of non-Western colonies, nations, and 4 places: Japan, China, India, and then the continent of Africa. So let's get going. So the strength of Western imperialism, it really derives from the Industrial Revolution, which allows the British and other nations to build steamships, to build better armaments, to travel more quickly across the globe, and to field, quite frankly, to field armies that are just stronger than the armies of these other places. It's also true that Western Europe had a concept of white man civilizing, Rudyard Kipling's concept of saving the native, so to speak, saving what we wouldn't call it native, of course, it's indigenous peoples, but that was Kipling's terminology. So the Western imperialists spread throughout the globe in the 19th century. The British, in particular, went to East Asia. They got spheres of influence in China. They had already occupied parts of India, but they actually they expanded in India. And then in 1858, they actually took over all of India that they could control, and they ran it through the British government instead of the British East India Company. And so the British were actually gaining control. And then in the late 19th century, the British went into Western Africa and took over large parts of Western Africa. Other European nations, the French, the Germans, the Dutch, were very involved in imperialism. Of course, the Dutch took Southeast Asia. The Germans took parts of China, islands in the Pacific, and then East Africa. And the French, North Africa and southern China. And there are varying degrees of control. In Africa, these were colonies. In China, they were spheres of influence, which is basically sovereignty stayed with China, sort of. And then policing power, trade, kind of an exclusive sphere of trade and economic exploitation for the European imperialists. Okay, so by the end of the 19th century, then China is pretty much controlled in the north, south, west, and kind of southwest by Western imperialists. And so is Africa. Africa is pretty much colonized by 1900. So one of the questions that I'm very interested in is, how did these non-Western places that were either under threat of imperialism or were actually imperialized, how did they actually respond to the Western intrusion? And so let's take those 4 cases and let's talk first about China. China is a very big country, a very important country. And before the 19th century, they were one of the foremost powers in the world. But in the 19th century, they get into trouble. They have the opium issue. Lots of opium comes into China. Silver flows out of China, so they lose money. And they also lose their scholarly bureaucrat class, which becomes addicted to opium. And they try to resist this, but then the British come in and they attack China with their gunboats going up rivers. And the result is the Opium Wars, and then the Treaty of Nanking, which is an unequal treaty in which the terms favor the British, not the Chinese. And so in these unequal treaties, actually, then this becomes a model for unequal treaties throughout the rest of the 19th century to impose unfair conditions on indigenous nations and colonies. And so the British are going in and they're taking control over various parts. The Chinese are trying to resist this. I mean, they fight two wars against the British, two opium wars. They're not successful in either. And then, pardon me, and then they try to self-strengthen. They have a self-strengthening movement in the 1860s, and then another self-strengthening movement in the 1890s. Both of them fail, in large part because there are conservatives in China who say, no, we don't want this. All we need is Confucianism. We need to get back to Confucianism, and that's enough. And that doesn't work because, of course, by this time, the Western powers have much better technology than China, and they're much more aggressive than China. And China has to find a way out of this. So China fails. It succumbs to imperialism. Now, Japan's a different case because Japan recognizes early on that the Western powers are a threat. And there's also an opportunity in there because you can learn from the West. You can adopt Western technologies, and then you can actually use those technologies and those ideas to actually fight against the West. So the Japanese actually succeed, and they succeed. It's a complicated story, but they succeed in part because the previous regime was so weak that it just disintegrated during the Meiji Restoration. And this new regime was committed to nationalism. They were committed to the nation, and they were committed to doing whatever it took, whether it was, modernizing their industry, which they did. They built a textiles industry with machines, and it became very successful and actually created export markets for silk, for Japanese silk. They built a navy. They built an army. They changed their education system. And so the Japanese became very successful in resisting Western imperialism. Westerners never came into Japan because of this, because the Japanese showed strength. Eventually, of course, Japan becomes an empire. But the important thing for this lecture is that Japan was able to reverse the unequal treaties that they had been forced to sign, in 1858. They reversed those unequal treaties. And by 1900, then they're getting out of these unequal treaties. They're not being treated on an equal level, but they're being treated more fairly by the West than, for instance, China at this point. So that's Japan and China, and it's this study in contrast, China failing, Japan succeeding, and there's some good comparisons there. And the Japanese do this through openness to change. The Chinese are not open to change, and those are probably the biggest factors. Let's take India next. India succumbs to Western imperialism, to British imperialism, pretty early on in the late 18th century. And by the 19th century, the British are in control of much of India. And then there's a rebellion in 1857, the Sepoy Rebellion, and then in 1858, the British say, forget about it. We're going to rule India directly. And it becomes a crown colony. It becomes Great Britain's most important colony. The British get lots of cotton from India for their textiles mills back in Great Britain. And so it's a colony that makes Great Britain powerful, but it also costs a lot because the British run this directly, and they have all kinds of bureaucrats and civil servants, some of whom come from Great Britain, and many others of whom are Indians, South Asians, who are trained by the British. And so do the Indians resist British imperialism? Yes, of course, the Sepoy Rebellion, that doesn't work. But in the late 19th century, a number of kind of groups resisting British imperialism crop up, including the India National Congress movement, which becomes a political party and is still a political party in India today. And so these are organizations and groups of people who are resisting. And there are some who say, hey, we need to use violence. There are others like Mahatma Gandhi who says, no, nonviolence is the key. Nonviolent disobedience is the key. Gandhi actually focused on textiles. and he encouraged Indians to, because the British had destroyed the indigenous Indian textiles industry, Gandhi encouraged Indian peasants to take up spinning and weaving of their own cloth, so they didn't have to rely on the British to get access to good quality textiles and good quality clothing. So, but the other thing to be said about textiles is very important. Okay, as we learned in the Industrial Revolution lecture, textiles is the key really to imperialism, because it allows the British to enter these countries and destroy their indigenous textiles industries and replace them with cloth and thread that comes from Great Britain, and so that favors the British. So India has a variety of resistance. Then, of course, India eventually is able to get its independence after World War II, but it's a long road for India. By the way, China is also able to throw the Westerners out, but it's only at the end of World War II that the Chinese government, the new Chinese Communist government, is actually throws out the Westerners and the treaty ports and the rest of it. So now Africa, of course, is the most complex of all, because it's a continent and not just one nation or a group of regions. So the responses of Africa are quite various. For instance, Ethiopia, which is its own kingdom in the late 19th century, resists Italian imperialism and actually wins a war and a battle against the Italians called the Battle of Adawa in 1896. And this is quite an achievement. And they do this in part because they model their modernization movement just in part on the Japanese. This is the other thing about responses to imperialism. As we get into the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, then these indigenous peoples begin to look to Japan as a model for resisting imperialism. And that's quite an interesting development. Now, other parts of Africa succumb to Western imperialism. The Zulu peoples in South Africa resist the British, but are beaten in battle. There are examples in East Africa of rulers who say, I'm going to accommodate to the British, and we'll sign treaties and such with the British, and they're able to maintain some forms of autonomy because of that. So, but the picture is definitely one of very strong imperialism, and the attempts at resistance are very difficult. And it means that Africans are really put under the thumb of Western imperialists in the late 19th and the early 20th century. They don't have a lot of options. They don't have a lot of autonomy. And the Western powers basically can dictate to them. Okay, that's it for today. Have a good rest of the week. Aloha.